For the last 3 years, I have served as troop leader of the Pawnee Rangers. This is our handbook. I wrote the whole thing myself.
When men stop acting like men, everyone is doomed. Towards the end of last year, I posted a short video titled 2 Bible Verses Every Christian Man Should Live By in 2021. The 2 verses were 1 Corinthians chapter 16, verses 13 and 14. Be watchful, stand firm in the faith, act like men, be strong. Let all that you do be done in love. My video was directed at Christians, but recent events have convinced me that there are some non-Christians who really need to live by these verses. Take the recent exodus from Afghanistan following the Taliban takeover. We've seen footage of people at the Kabul airport trying to get out of Afghanistan by clinging to the side of a U.S. military jet. Do you notice anything about the people who are trying to force their way out of Afghanistan? They seem to be overwhelmingly grown men. Here's a now famous picture from inside the C-17. These are people who forced their way into a jet that was about to leave the Kabul airport. The U.S. military decided to take off rather than try to force the people off the jet. Now, there are some women and children here, but I'd say that 75 to 80% of the people on board are grown men. This reminds me of the Syrian refugee crisis of 2015, when tens of thousands of Syrian refugees marched into Europe. Notice anything about these refugees? They seem to be overwhelmingly grown men. Here's the irony. Who are the people who are best able to fend for themselves in a dangerous, war-torn area? Grown men are best able to fend for themselves in a dangerous, war-torn area. But who are the people who are best able to flee a dangerous, war-torn area? Grown men are best able to flee a dangerous, war-torn area. The people who are best able to fend for themselves are simultaneously the people who are best able to run and leave everyone else behind. And that's why we need rules, my friends.
This girl gave me a rough time one time. She goes, well, why does a guy make more an hour to do the exact same job? I go, I'll tell you why. Because in the unlikely event that we're both on a Titanic and it starts to sink, for some screwed up reason, you get to leave with the kids and I have to stay.
Think about the Titanic. Let's look at some statistics about survivors of the Titanic. There were 434 women on the Titanic, most of them passengers, the rest were staff. 324 survived. So 75% of women survived. There were 112 children on the Titanic, 56 survived. So 50% of children survived. There were 1,680 men on the Titanic, slightly more staff and crew than passengers. 323 survived. So 19% of men survived. And we could break this down a bit more to see why even more women and children didn't survive. Most of the women and children who died were in the steerage section. The steerage section was the lower decks, the bottom of the ship. These women and children were just in a bad area of the ship if they needed to get out. The women and children in first and second class, the upper decks, almost all of them survived. 97% of women in first class survived. 86% of women in second class survived. 86% of children in first class survived. 100% of children in second class survived. And yet, most men died. Now, which people were best able to get into lifeboats if they really wanted to? The grown men. But most of the grown men died. Which people were least able to get into lifeboats? Women and children. But most of the women and children survived. What does this mean? It means that most of the men who were on the Titanic would rather die than trample on women and children to save themselves. Looking at the Syrian refugees marching across Europe in 2015 and the Afghan refugees fleeing Afghanistan, I get the distinct impression that if the Titanic had been filled with Syrians and Afghans and the ship started going down, the survival statistics would say that 90 to 95% of survivors were grown men. What's going on here? Why are grown men leaving their wives and mothers and sisters and children, expecting their wives and mothers and sisters and children to fend for themselves against terrorists? These guys are like George Costanza when a fire breaks out. How would you not rather die than abandon women and children? How is that C-17 not filled with women and children? Now, to be fair, again, there were women and children on that jet, which means that some men fought to get those women and children on that jet. But those men were a tiny minority. Look, the principle here is very simple. And the more general principle doesn't just apply to men, it applies to everyone. Sometimes certain people have an advantage over other people. It could be a political advantage. It could be a financial advantage. It could be an intellectual advantage. It could be an advantage in status and strength and all kinds of things. There will be times when it's perfectly acceptable to use your advantage to your advantage. But there will be other times when the right thing to do is to use your advantage to help people who don't have that advantage. When things get violent, when societies break down, men have an advantage. There are lots of women in the world who are tough and who can beat up a variety of men. But for the most part, on average, men have a clear advantage. In Islam, the message seems to be, if you have an advantage, if you're bigger, if you're stronger, if you have a majority, whatever, you use that advantage to oppress and trample on everyone else. You don't use your advantage to help the disadvantaged. You use your advantage for yourself and to force everyone to obey the commands of an illiterate 7th century Arabian caravan robber. And we see the results. When things get violent, when societies break down, women and children are abandoned. They're expendable. In Ephesians 5:25, the Apostle Paul said, "Husbands, love your wives as Christ loved the church and gave himself up for her." Christ was crucified for the church. According to the Bible, then, husbands should be ready to be crucified for their wives if the situation arises. The same idea would apply to fathers with respect to their children. You see, when your supreme moral example is someone who endured torture and death for the sake of others, it has an impact on what you view as right and wrong. But when your supreme moral example is someone who had sex with a prepubescent girl and took the wife of his own adopted son after causing the divorce by lusting after her, and had sex with his slave girls and tortured a man for money and taught his followers to beat their wives into submission, in other words, a violent, selfish man, this also affects your view of right and wrong. Going back to the verses I mentioned at the beginning, let's adapt these for our Muslim friends. 1 Corinthians chapter 16, verses 13 and 14. Be watchful. That applies to people in general, not just to Christian men. Stand firm in the faith. Do not do this, Muslims. Taliban jihadis stand firm in your faith, and look where it leads. Act like men, not like your fake prophet. Be strong. Don't abandon women and children to save yourselves. Let all that you do be done in love. That's probably the most difficult of all in Islam, since doing everything in love is antithetical to your religion. But let me tell you this, in a spirit of true love. You need a new religion.